thought already about how ecosystems change through time or along just gradients, elevation gradients or environmental gradients. I'm going to transition now into thinking a little bit about how ecosystems work in terms of how elements are cycled, how water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, how these things are cycled through ecosystems. So starting out here with a image of a photo here of people walking on the pumice plains of Mount St. Helens. So an ecosystem that underwent primary succession relatively recently in 1980, and the process is ongoing. So you can kind of see the development of future forest here in the foreground. So there are multiple elements that cycle through ecosystems that are really important for ecosystem function. And all of these elements interact, and they interact in different molecular forms and in different amounts. So this graph coming from Perry et al. Shows CO2 coming into ecosystems, being released from ecosystems through respiration. Nitrogen coming in as N2 gas is fixed into usable forms and brought into soils, denitrification occurring where dinitrogen gas is produced, evapotranspiration where water is moved through systems, precipitation where water comes into systems, and directions where water moves out and through systems, and several other fluxes and pools. And all of these things are interacting. And so we, of course, we're under no illusion about this. Very few ecosystem scientists, people who intentionally are studying fluxes of energy and elements through systems, few would say that these things don't interact. But in order to really think about each element in detail, we need to think about them one at a time and then work on kind of combining and thinking about their effects when combined all together. They're kind of synthetic effects. So we're going to focus on a few key elements here, and we're going to focus on them one at a time, talking about the things that make cycles of each of these elements unique, recognizing that, of course, they're actually also interacting with other elements and other cycles. Okay, so I want to go through the kind of key important elements in ecosystems. Of course, all elements are important. Every component of an ecosystem is important, but some have a more limiting effect or a more known effect on ecosystem function than others. We'll talk about energy input, energy transfer, energy output a little bit, and we'll talk about energy through ecosystems, photosynthesis, respiration. We'll talk a little bit about energy flow, if we can get to it by the end, trophic levels and food webs. These are all at the bottom here, these points are long-term goals for understanding this material. Okay, so at first, if you're a typical ecologist, when we start talking about just individual elements, it may not seem like the most exciting component of thinking about ecosystems. But if you think about it in terms of what we're working with on a more kind of universal scale, it is exciting, because talking about elements in ecosystems allows us to see some unity between ecosystems in terms of their function, in terms of how they operate, between ecosystems that can be very different. And we can make some generalizations about how ecosystems function based on considering some key elements. So just a little joke to start us out here, and then a transition into the ever exciting periodic table. So of course, the periodic table is diverse, and I think one surprise to an ecosystem ecologist is actually how few elements that we can focus on in detail and talk about the majority of what's happening in ecosystems. We're going to talk a lot about how carbon works in ecosystems. We're going to talk a fair amount about how nitrogen works in ecosystems. Oxygen and hydrogen are going to kind of come along for the ride with what happens with carbon to some extent. We often don't talk about the cycle of those atoms individually very much. And then we'll have phosphorus, and we'll talk some about sulfur and a few other key elements. But between carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, we kind of have the three main elements that we get to spend a lot of our time thinking about, because these make up the majority of the biomass of living organisms, along with oxygen and hydrogen. They are the main conduits for kind of energy exchange between components of ecosystems, or they're main elements involved in creating complex molecules that are important for information exchange, for protein synthesis, for RNA, for DNA. The majority of what we're talking about can be encapsulated in thinking about cycles of these three key elements. So starting with nitrogen, nitrogen is 78% of the atmosphere, but it's in a triple bonded N2 molecule that takes tremendous energy to break. And so because of that, there's this fundamental interesting phenomena where we are surrounded by nitrogen. If you take a breath in, you're breathing almost 80% nitrogen, yet you can't access it. And so in order to access it, there's a more complicated set of biological operators that need to come to light. Phosphorus, we'll go through the phosphorus cycle. The simplest form is just recognizing that phosphorus is something that is often beginning with an igneous or a rock form, and then it's eroded out of the rocks in the cycle and becomes biologically available, and is cycled internally. And then carbon, recognizing that carbon makes up about 50% of all plant biomass for most organisms. Carbon is a large component of what we're made up of. It's the most abundant single element in our bodies, in most organisms. So these three things are critically important for understanding how ecosystems function. There's nitrogen. Phosphorus comes from rocks. Let's talk about carbon. Okay, carbon, of course, has a large reservoir that is in our atmosphere, and in order for the carbon cycle to really get started, of course, we need to get it out of the atmosphere and into biomass. And of course, the biggest engine for doing that is plant biomass and photosynthesis. So when we're talking about input of carbon into ecosystems, what we are really talking about is photosynthesis. Now, you've probably seen the photosynthesis equation before. It's a rare person that hasn't. The general idea in a balanced form of the generalized photosynthesis equation is that you have six molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water that are combined with energy from light, and this splits off 6 molecules of O2 gas, giving us, tremendous oxygen that makes our world inhabitable. And at the same time, that CO2 is fixed into a carbon compound. And this is often generalized as C6H12O6, organic carbon energy. Thinking about this more deeply, though, it's important that we recognize that that's actually not what happens. It's a generalized form of what happens. Carbon is fixed into a sugar molecule or a carbon-based molecule that's biologically usable. But actually, the first product of most photosynthesis in our region, in a northern temperate forest, is a 3-carbon molecule. And so we call this C3 photosynthesis, and the first stable compound is a result of an enzyme that fixes a 5-carbon molecule together with CO2 to make a very short-lived 6-carbon compound that breaks apart almost immediately into 2 3-carbon compounds, one of which continues in a cycle to go back and fix more carbon dioxide, and the other molecule can be taken and shunted over into central metabolic pathways and then made into different types of sugars. So now that we're a little bit more advanced in thinking about this, it's realistic to say, okay, that C6H12O6 thing is it's a convenient placeholder for saying a bunch of stuff happens with the CO2 that was fixed, and it all does balance out, but it balances out in different ways. But this carbon fixation, regardless of how you think about it, in the simple form or the complex form, it forms the basis for energy transfer for the rest of life in ecosystems. So why is it so important to think about carbon? Because carbon is really the carrier for transfer of information. It's the currency by which life thrives, by which reproduction happens, by which patterns of biological diversity are sustained, and by which the atmosphere is interacted with and maintained at, in the past at least, relatively stable levels of CO2. So carbon forms the basis for energy transfer among the rest of life in ecosystems. These are mangrove forests that I was taking some images of, and some nice images of ants and mangroves there. Now, of course, the carbon uptake is happening in a very particular way, and this is where we really start getting close to understanding how the cycles of different elements and energy are all so tightly intertwined. So in order for a plant to take up carbon, of course, the plants can't just soak it up exactly like a sponge. They have to actually bring CO2 into the plant through tiny little pores we call stomata. So this is a close-up image, electron scanning microscope image of stomata on a leaf surface. In this case, they're open. And the problem with stomata, of course, is that when they're open to take up CO2, they're also open in a way that they can lose water. Just an image displaying what we're talking about here. We're talking about the surface of the leaf. Very close look at the surface of the leaf, and you would find both on the bottom and on the surface and on the upper surface, depending on the plant, you might find these little tiny pores, the stomata. On many plants, you'll only find these on the underside of the leaf, and that's especially true in arid climates. And on some of our tree species, you'll actually also find pores on the tree trunk itself, tiny pores that we call lenticels that essentially function like stomata do to some extent, but they'll actually be on the woody surface of the plant. So let's talk a little bit about water. Of course, water cycles are generalizable, and these are large cycles that we learned about in grade school, although I'm sure you didn't focus much on the specific units or amounts of transfer. But of course, we have tremendous reservoirs of water, obviously, in our oceans and in our atmosphere. The details of the water cycle are something that we don't really need to go too much into, although when we're thinking about an individual forest, we're going to want to think about this in much greater detail. So this is an important cycle for regulating organisms on the planet, and we're going to come back to this when we think about the hydrology and operation of individual forest and water cycles within those forests. Like we talked about before, when stomata are open, of course, the consequence of being open to bring in CO2 is that a plant is going to lose water. And so there's always a balance that has to go on there within any forest organisms. This is one of the reasons why conifers in our region likely close down tremendously in the middle of summer in terms of their water transport. They don't want to lose a lot of water, and they actually close down their photosynthesis tremendously in the middle of summer. So in the middle of summer, which seems like it should be a prime time for photosynthesis, some of our plants may actually shut down photosynthesis just so they don't lose water, and then turn back on high rates of photosynthesis during the shoulder seasons when water becomes available again.